So good morning, y'all. So my name is Mike. I'm from Austin, Texas, and kind of here to talk about a couple of different things today. One of them is sales, the framework, but also in a more general sense, what this whole full stack Node.js development thing looks like in the first place. So just a quick little background first. I have a startup in Austin that does services. So we work with companies that come to us and say, hey, build us this, and we build that thing. And when I started this company, I sort of made a bet on would I be able to do everything that we do on the back end in Node.js. And this was 2 years ago, and it came close to not working out, but worked out, especially thanks to the work of a lot of people, including D. Shaw. A lot of times it's sort of like this, where these days people come to us to work on sales apps, which is great because it's just mutually beneficial. Didn't start that way at all. We did mostly front-end JavaScript stuff, and I think a lot of us that are involved in Node right now know what that's like, where you kind of have to slowly penetrate in the back end. And if you're in if you're in a larger organization, like I know PayPal did this with their prototyping stack, but you end up sometimes having to even build a intermediary layer just so that you don't end up rewriting stuff that's sort of protected in other parts of the organization. So you end up getting into a lot of that stuff. But I guess before we get too deep into it, some stuff about me. Obviously, I'm a little biased. I really like Node. I've got a lot of skin in the game. I obviously like sales, and I don't like CoffeeScript very much. And it's no offense to anyone. But back in 2011, I completely fell in love with Node, and I quit my job shortly after that, and it was a huge deal for me. And the main reason why was because this dude in a pink sweatshirt talked about the thing that was just so painfully obvious, but none of the rest of us are seeing, which is that there's these two fundamentally very different kinds of operations we do. And one is in memory. It takes, tiny amount of time, infinitesimal, doesn't really matter. And then there's this stuff that we're treating exactly the same, but could take millions of times longer, like writing a network or writing a disk or reading in the same way. So he said, no, that's not cool. Why don't we find a better way to do that, right? And threads are kind of hard. And he got so excited in this particular example. These are actually his words in the black here, that he started talking in German. And this is Ryan Dahl, right? He felt like maybe we should, instead of using threads, instead of just having this priority being on everyone, we're only going to trust developers to write synchronous line after line code, and we're not going to trust developers to manage that concurrency themselves. But he wanted to do that in a way that made sense and was easy to grasp, right? And how would that be possible? Well, we're already doing that in the browser, right? We've been doing that for years. So there's that, and there's that. And that's the 240 million X network call, right? And it seems very familiar. So that was awesome. And so that was what sold me, right? And the fact that it was all one language, I think a lot of us just saw that and were like, wow, this is great. Can we use it? Absolutely. And at the time, a lot of people got into it to do chat, right? And you kind of have this like little chat server alongside your Javas or your Rails. But what about just like everything, right? Like if you want to just only do Node on the back end, go all the way down and completely replace every other back end technology you have, right? And you still have a database, right? And you're still going to integrate with other things, but the point is really organizationally being able to take on Node and say it's going to be our stack. So Ryan had a perspective on that too, and he sort of said, well, web servers are important, but you should use a web framework, and we're not going to really deal with that in Node Core, because Node Core needs to be focused on what it does best, which is providing this really nice library to access stuff like the file system and HTTP, right? Accessing TCP sockets. And he said, you shouldn't be writing those system calls. Someone will make a framework And at the time, I was just kind of like, oh man, that is going to be me. I really want to be that person. And I think there was a lot of people that ended up rolling their own frameworks over that period of time. And I think the thing that we got lucky on was that we were just so annoyingly persistent, and we just had a lot of new projects, right, that we were able to stick with it long enough. And that's where this thing came from. So that was 2 years ago. About a year ago, people started finding out about it and transitioned pretty quickly into something that was the primary thing that we do, right? So what is it? It started off as, our particular way we solved this problem of doing complete server-side Node.js, and learned a lot from that. So how many of you guys have worked with Node on a kind of production app level so far? Okay. So there's a couple of ways. When you start thinking about JavaScript on the server, you start to think about this distinction of front end versus back end, and you ask yourself, like, well, it's the same language, so maybe we can share the code, right? And that's kind of true sometimes, but what the stance that we take, and what's been, I think, effective to make stuff work with Node on the back end is, or JavaScript on the back end, is taking a very hard stance of an API-driven architecture, like D. Shaw was saying earlier. And we built it on Express, so we took what was already pretty solid. At that time it was Express 2, now it's Express 3. Probably will be Express 4, depending on what happens there. But and so it's JavaScript that runs on the server. Not really any code sharing per se. You could absolutely do that, but there's not enough benefit from sharing that code unless it's something like validations, right? Your data model and your back end on the front end are not the same thing. In some cases, rare cases they are, but they're usually not because your front end is not purely RESTful. Otherwise, you're making PHP MyAdmin, right? So there's a lot of stuff we could talk about on this subject, and a lot of it just goes into the details of how do you write a web framework, or like what's involved in any web framework. But there's a few things in particular when dealing with Node that we can talk about here, whether you're using Sails or not, that I think will be helpful for you guys. So first and foremost, one of the primary responsibilities of any web application is to take requests coming in and then do something, right? There's code that runs when this message comes in. There's structure to this thing, right? This is why it's not just a simple library. There's some default kind of convention over configuration style thing that you're going to go with. This varies on a framework by framework basis. With Sails, we kind of went the way of Rails. And then the last thing is, which is probably the most important thing, is what Sails does for you, and specifically what our ORM waterline does for you in communicating with the database. So also, the other thing is managing multiple data sources, right? A lot of real-world applications, you're not going to want to say, like, I'm going 100% with MySQL, and all of my data will live in MySQL, because actually I want 2 of my models to live in Redis, right? And 1 of them in Mongo. And you should be able to do associations between those, which is another thing. But Sails is not a front-end framework, right? So if you're making a native iOS app, or you're making an Android app or PhoneGap with Angular or Backbone or Ember or whatever, that's kind of a separate question. Sails is solving what Express, which it's wrapping, and Socket.io, which it's wrapping, solve. And it does provide some task automation and some kind of build workflow for you, but that's totally optional. Okay. So this is how it kind of started. You can think about, how many of you guys have done chat before? Okay, awesome. So when you're writing a chat application and you're using sockets or long polling, you can think about there's an outgoing communication. Like once you have an open socket established, you can send a message and say, hey, there's new chats for you, right? Or there's new notifications for you. The other way, when the actual client sends a request to the server, whether that's over WebSockets or HTTP, couldn't we just say that was a request, right? So what Sails does is kind of eliminate the distinction between the way that that works. So this is, jQuery.get sending a message, sending a request to the hello routes and getting the response. You could do the same thing for WebSockets if you provide an interface like that, right? And the neat thing is, if you use the incoming from the server's perspective interface in this way, you actually end up getting to use the same code for both things. And then your Express code that you already have just drops into Sales, and you actually support WebSockets automatically. And that was pretty cool because we were doing a lot of real-time work at the beginning especially, and it made like half the code that we had to write. So, and then if you want to kind of negotiate that, you can check to see if it's a socket. And we just kind of, basically, somewhere in Sales, I'm doing var rec equals object, var res equals object, and it just kind of builds that thing up, right? But it works. So that's really all there is to the request interpreter. As far as structure, what Sales does is follow pretty closely what you might be used to from Django or Rails or Grails or Cake PHPs and those guys, CodeIgniter. In the same way that Django is kind of built on top of Python, Laravel's on PHP, Grails is on Groovy, Rails is on Ruby, ASP.NET MVC is on C#, and Spring is on Java. I guess .NET is technically on Visual Basic too, if you want to go that way. But Sales is on Node, and that's really all there is structurally. There's some quirks that are, each of these MVC frameworks have their own way of doing stuff, but really it's kind of just sits there in the mix with the rest. So a few things that are specific that are worth noting about the way that we do stuff is there's an asset pipeline. By default, that's Grunt. So out of the box, you're going to get some Grunt tasks. You can kind of plug in any Grunt task you like. And that's not necessarily how you have to keep things. You may not want to have any kind of task automation if you're making a pure backend API and you don't want to do your scheduled jobs in that way. So that you can use gulp if you'd rather. It's all just about which hook and which generator you choose. By default, you're going to get Grunt though, just because again the convention over configuration deal. Like, it'd be better to have some kind of default that solves that problem. So the other thing is, you'll find when working with Sales, you have the rec and the res object that you're used to from Express and Connect and Node HTTP itself. You'll find that there's a callback pattern with the error argument as the first argument and the data as the second argument. Everything is installed via NPM. It is absolutely at its core my homage to the way of thinking that Ryan and Isaac set up, right? So it's we are trying to do nothing that is not completely in line with what everyone else in the core Node team would be doing, right? We do have support for promises in the ORM, but that's not something that we're, it's definitely not required, right? If that's your thing, you can do it. And the other, kind of the neat thing about that is we also support existing Express code because of the fact that it's built on Express, right? And it just sort of, you get the bonus of the WebSocket support as well. Cool, and I'm kind of rushing through because I want to show you guys something I made earlier this morning, which is pretty cool. So there's, when I think about an ORM back in the old way, like I really tried to avoid building this for a long time and couldn't because there wasn't really anything out there at that time that supported Mongo and MySQL at the same time. And so this ended up happening over a couple weeks during Christmas of the end of 2012, which was really a lot of fun, actually. And what wasn't fun was what happened later with this sort of explosion of different things that we ended up having to support. Luckily, I found that if you really just kind of isolate, find, create, update, destroy, describe, define, alter, and drop, you can make these adapters which are even definable at the app level. So if you want to have like an LDAP adapter in your app, or you want to have a Active Directory adapter in your app, you can do that, and really you can kind of I did a Raspberry Pi GPIO adapter once where there was a lamp model, and the lamp model, you could update it to be on or off, right? And we cut this extension cord in half and did this thing. And there's a video online of that. But it's not necessarily meant for that sort of thing. But you can totally do it. These are these are 4 out of 5 of the adapters that we officially support right now. The 5th one is local disk, and that's what you're going to get by default, much like in Rails how you get SQLite. There actually are about 20 different adapters that exist in the community, amongst them Oracle, SQL Server, and DB2, and also SQLite. Working on cleaning that up. Right now there's still a lot of duplication, just because people don't necessarily know that each other are working on the same adapter. But the cool thing about Waterline to point out, I think, is much like if you ever worked with Grails or Hibernate, and if you've used the multiple data sources plugin, that's where a lot of this, what's in Waterline, came kind of straight out of Hibernate in my experience with that. But something that I found at least is important is the ability to sort of put your models, like your database tables, right, or your Mongo collections, in different places, and then be able to like switch those around. So like you might have your users in MySQL, and then you actually might have, here I have administrators, you might have like legacy users in a different MySQL database. We call that a connection in Waterline, but it's like a different data store. If you think about those things as really they could live everywhere, that's kind of step one, and that gets you pretty far. The next step is basically that, where then if you want to do an association, like a named association between, if users have activity and that activity lives in Redis. So we're 90% of the way here in the current release. And the tricky bit is if you've ever used Mongoose and you do .populate, that's kind of the interface that we expose. When you start trying to populate with a pagination or a sort, you end up kind of writing this cursor thing that's like a little mini database. And that's a real big mess, and there's a project called Waterline 2 that's dealing with that. But probably the 1.0 release of Waterline won't have support for that feature. But you'll be able to do this, you just won't be able to paginate, right? So I could get, if I find a particular user in Postgres, I could get all of their activity in Redis, or I could even get all of their activity that is more recent than this morning. But I couldn't get the first 30 most important activities from this morning. Which seems like there's ways to work around that, but it's a nice to have. I guess kind of the last thing before we get into the demo is just we've kind of updated this doc this morning, and so we're at almost 8,000 GitHub stars, and there's a bunch of folks in IRC. So if you're looking to get into sales, it's a great time to do that, and there's a pretty active community in IRC in particular that's super helpful. Look for Rob W. Especially, and a few others. So with that, let's see how much time we have left, but I was going to just show you guys something I did this morning. If anyone has any pressing questions, let me know. So this is just to give you a quick, let's give you a quick example first. So, to make a new sales project, I would use sales new some blog or whatever. And inside of some blog, I get something that looks like this. Which is API controllers, models, policies, responses, services. I have my configuration, and I have assets, which is basically like my public web folder. That's where you put like your style sheets and stuff. Tasks is where the grunt tasks live by default. Out of the box, you get support for less, copy scripts on the front end if you're into that, and minification in production. Views is server rendered views, right, versus single page app kind of stuff. So that's just to kind of show you that. And then one other cool thing about sales is that you can do this. And then if you sales generate API user, what that's going to do is use this thing called blueprints. And that means you can go to /user and you get this RESTful JSON API that you can kind of use out of the gate. So if I want to find users with name equal to foobar, I can do that. If I want to get real crazy, I think I can even do this. We'll see. Yeah, I think I can do where name contains. So you can use this for type as, kind of type ahead search, which is handy because you don't have to write any code for it, on the back end at least. So contains foo. Didn't quite do it right, I think. There we go. So that's the one that contains foo, and obviously you wouldn't be typing this in the URL bar normally. Obviously you can disable this because it's terrible to leave that on in production, but it's really handy for right now when you're playing around. And the other cool thing about this actually is you don't have to, this is called shortcut blueprints, the fact that I'm able to access it via GET requests that I was able to do a create. The default REST blueprints can actually work out pretty well in production, or you can use them, right, and bind your own custom routes to them, and it can save some time. So just to check out the example from earlier today, this is a little cursor sharing app. It has no backend code, so when you do sales generate API, you're going to get an empty controller and an empty model. All I wrote in here, really, other than running sales generate API cursor, was this. I brought in this dependencies folder, I brought in jQuery Lodash in Angular, just because it's the fastest way I could think of to do it. And then this is the front end code. Oops. So basically, there's that thing, and then there's this thing, which is, there's a little ng app. Here's my horrible inline style sheet, and what we get when we look at this is this thing. So basically, what's happening here is using, the other thing about blueprints I didn't mention, sorry, that's important, is that whenever you do a find, the blueprint actions that are bundled, kind of for funsies, make the assumption that if you're finding a record via the API, you probably are going to show it somewhere, and then if it changes, you might want to hear about it in the UI so then you could update it. So by finding all the records of cursor, and I'm just hitting /cursor, if I hit it over HTTP, I'm going to get that. If I hit it over WebSockets, like this, and I don't know if any of you guys, what do you think is going to happen if I try to run that right now? I don't know if you ever tried to pass console.log in as a function in Chrome. Firefox will let you do that. Chrome, you have to do this because console.log is a protected function or something. Anyways, all that's doing is basically having a callback where we log the arguments. Those are the two. This is the same thing, right? So this is, we kind of again we get that for free. But what happened because I ran this is I actually subscribed and I'm watching that. So I found two things. I'm subscribed to each of those records, and I'm also watching for new records that might be created. So if I open up a new tab, you can see it. It heard about the new thing that came in. So this is handy, and especially for certain use cases, it can basically eliminate your need to write code, which is great. There comes a time when you end up needing to write code anyways. But let me pull up basically how this works, and then we'll look at what actually is getting used. So this is Angular. Have you guys worked with Angular before? Okay. Basically, Angular has the magic data binding thing, and then this is it grabbing the cursor, the name of the cursor, which is just being generated randomly on the front end. And then it's just looping over all the cursors, and it's positioning them absolutely using this thing that I had to look up this morning, because I didn't even know that was an option until earlier. But basically, I'm just making this controller, which is, or I like to call it control to avoid getting confused with the backend controllers. But there's this UI control called app control. The network calls it makes, which is what I'll focus on just to keep it brief, is it's getting this thing, and I guess we should actually mention that, also subscribes. And then I just added this thing because I wanted to only get the cursors that were from the last 15 seconds, because otherwise you end up with all these like terrible things all over the page. So you can see when I refresh, I don't end up with, I can keep refreshing and I'm going to get a bunch, but in 15 seconds or so, the old ones will go away. So there I'm just using blueprints again. If I wanted to write backend code that did that, it would look something like this. Yeah, well, I'd have to parse it and stuff, but basically something along these lines. And then I would do .exec, or I can pass that in as the last argument, and so on. And just to point this out, in case you're playing around with this later, res.negotiate is kind of the preferred way to do stuff. But that's more or less what it's doing in a generic way. I mean, it's actually, there's actually a where parameter, and it's parsing that as JSON and doing a try-catch, but you get the idea. So we're getting the cursors, which also subscribe this. Whenever we join the page, like whenever we load the page, we're also, the first thing we do is get the cursors and subscribe. Then we always create a new cursor for ourselves, and we just randomly generate a name for us. And we just set our initial position as x and y equals 0, because the reason why that's fine is every time we move the mouse with throttling that at 30 milliseconds, we're going to keep feeding update events to the server. Which actually works pretty well. So I had this thing for a while that may still be online that does something similar to this. Yeah, okay, so this is actually still online if you ever want to play with it. It's using, this is pre-sale, so this is using just Socket.io and Express. It's a little janky, but it's the same idea, and that's where I got the idea for this demo from. It looks like it actually may have crashed. This is from about over 2 years ago now. But anyways, that's the same idea. But really, it works pretty well under load, which is, again, thanks to Node, nothing that I'm doing in particular. And you can see it logging there as we move the mouse. Yeah, so I mean, we're doing that. We're creating the thing, and then if we want to hear about cursor events coming in, we just do this, and then we just kind of have a switch statement to look and see whether it was a created one or an updated one. And that's it. So I think if this sounds good to you guys, we could do a few questions. Yeah.
So is it safe to say that the DB portion of sales is basically does what Mongoose does, but for multiple different types of database connections?
Yeah, exactly. For specifically the ones that I use pretty regularly and test a lot are MySQL, Postgres, Redis, and Mongo. And then disk I use a lot, probably more than any of the rest of them, actually. Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Are the sales docs the best place to go to get started, or what are good resources that you recommend for somebody just starting to learn sales?
That's a great question. So this is what our website looks like. There's a lot of squids around. I would recommend checking these out. They're a little low level right now, and they're only that way because I just rewrote all of them. I didn't actually write any of the original docs, and so I'm actually really proud of the people that were able to stick it out in the first year or so. There's some good stuff here. There's a little overview of like what everything in your app does that's there by default. Definitely worth taking a look. If you find yourself having trouble with this, I would take a look at Salescasts. Just search it. And this is from a friend and an ally of the project named Earl. His name is not Nathan in IRL Nathan. It's actually Earl and spelled that way, weirdly enough. He's done a bunch of really great stuff. It's a little bit out of date now, so bear that in mind. But he goes into extreme level of detail. There's also a really good Modern Web article that That's at a conference, I think. Yeah. It's a 3-part article, and this was written, I think, in August. Yeah. So this is real recent. This covers using version 0.10. That was actually when we added associations officially. We've been using it in beta for about a year because it took that long. But it's actually, we released the official stable version of 0.10 in August. Not really built into blueprints, right? The blueprints are really just, if you think about a controller action, it's just basically a default controller action. There is this concept of resourceful pub sub, which basically lets you maintain socket.io rooms for you for a given record, or it maintains a classroom for the actual model itself to handle what we call a watch or like creates, which is different. There's also a bunch of stuff like around namespaces and stuff. You can get pretty deep in the weeds there. I think it is helpful at a certain point, but I'd almost suggest starting with, where you're getting into that side of it, starting with just the lower level socket methods, because it's more like socket.io, and if you worked with that before, it'll feel more familiar. But yeah, you can absolutely do that, and you can kind of, I've rolled something similar to operational transforms before with it, but there's not any kind of like affordance for that particular thing. Not yet, anyways. Yeah. No, not at all, and that's a good point. So no, not at all. And you might have seen when I first lifted this other guy that I just created, that and it's something that there's been a few people working on. This message was added recently by me because we had some guys lose some data in production. So in production, it's going to put it in migrate safe mode. Which is, if you have node env set to production like you would on any pass, or if you were deploying the app in production, it'll be fine. It's not going to touch your data. Otherwise, alter, what alter does is basically just delete your entire database, but not before loading it into memory, right? And then if it can't fit it all in memory, it crashes. If anything weird happens unexpectedly, it just logs everything it has to the console. So it is absolutely not a good idea to use alter in production. It's fantastic during development, though, because then you don't have to think about it at all. There's a project called Sales Migrations from these guys in Israel, Danny Friedland, and I can't remember the other guy's name right now. They're in the process of upgrading their project to 0.10. There we go. But that's kind of like Rails-style manual migrations. The auto migration problem, I see it as twofold. There's the actual schema changes for databases that care about that sort of thing. And even Mongo, if you have a unique validation and then you you add the unique validation later and you already had two things that weren't unique, and then it's like, what happens? Because it's actually using the physical layer validation mechanism. It's using that index to enforce it. That probably won't be solved in the sales core. I'm trying to, I think at any point in a large project, you get to the point where you're like, wow, we need to pull everything out into modules that other people can maintain. So we're getting there, and I think basically sales core is composed of 20 different hooks now, one of which is the ORM hook, so you can switch out Mongoose if you want. Really, the idea is to make those as completely pull-outable as possible, and I've been working with some of the guys on the original Express team about how we can even go further in that direction. But basically, I'd love to get to the point where we have auto migrations that just kind of magically work. Probably won't happen until we get a lot further. But thank you, everybody. I'll be around today if you want to chat.